Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us again at the CNHP seminar series. Glad you could join us. I'm Rob Shore. I'm a zoologist with the Colorado Natural Heritage Program, and I'm your host for these sessions. If any of you are coming to us from the Front Range of Colorado, you realize about a week ago we had a heavy onset of snow that caused quite a bit of tree damage. So I'm going to keep my speaking at a minimum because our neighbors are taking care of some broken limbs nearby. So every once in a while, heavy machinery starts up. So I'll try and keep my introduction as minimal as possible. So in that vein, I'm going to share with you my screen. He says.
Let me stop sharing, Rob.
I think I should still be able to. Oh, that's not the screen you want to share. Let me try this again. This is what happens when you have a host of programs open. No. I'll try this one more time. No. So what I'm going to do then is quickly close out of a host of things that I have going on to make sure that we're not getting any interference. And try this one more time. All right. So we're having some sharing issues, and this is not something that I think is absolutely necessary to share. So what I'm going to do is, try and get out of, well, I really apologize for this. There we go. I'm going to present to you what I had on the slide really quickly. And it seems like I might even be having some of my own Wi-Fi issues in conjunction with that. So I was going to take you through quickly, for those of you who haven't been exposed to these before, talk about the Colorado Natural Heritage Program briefly. So the Colorado Natural Heritage Program is hosted by Colorado State University, and we're part of international network of programs throughout the 50 states, throughout the provinces in Canada, and through a host of Central and South American countries, in a parent organization called NatureServe, where our mission is to try and help regions or states or provinces identify some of the areas where they would want to prioritize conservation. And here in Colorado, our mission is to advance the conservation of Colorado's native species and ecosystems through science, planning, and education for the benefit of current and future generations. And so some of the work that we present on these seminars is how we go about doing that. Sometimes it's identifying rare species, sometimes it's prioritizing conservation of whole complete systems like we're going to hear about today. And so before I introduce our next speakers, I did want to take you through the land acknowledgement statement for Colorado State University. Because we do work throughout Colorado, it's worth acknowledging exactly the history of those lands. So Colorado State University acknowledges with respect that the land CSU is on is the traditional and ancestral homelands of the Arapaho, Cheyenne, and Ute nations and peoples. The area of CSU was also a site of trade, gathering, and healing for numerous other native tribes. We recognize the indigenous peoples as original stewards of this land and all the relatives within it. As these words of acknowledgement are spoken and heard, the ties nations have to their traditional homelands are renewed and reaffirmed. CSU is founded as a land grant institution, and we accept that our mission must encompass access to education and inclusion, and significantly, that our founding came at a dire cost to Native nations and peoples whose land this university was built upon. This acknowledgement is the education and inclusion we must practice in recognizing our institutional history, responsibility, and commitment. So thank you again for joining us. I'm going to encourage you to, through the comments, let us know where you're coming from. And if you have questions throughout the presentation, submit those through the Q&A and I'll try and feed those to our presenters. So one of our presenters, Dr. Sarah Marshall, is an eco-hydrologist with CNHP. She has a PhD in water resources engineering and studies ecological restoration and the effects of land use on wetland hydrology, soils, and ecology. Sarah divides her time between fieldwork and mountain wetlands and developing tools and protocols to help partners assess, prioritize, conserve, and restore wetlands across Colorado. Our other presenter, Andrea Schuhmann, is an ecologist and zoologist that has worked for CNHP for almost 3 years. However, she has worked with other state heritage programs, including Mississippi and Missouri, for over a decade. Andrea studied elk, moose, black bear, neotropical migratory birds, bats, and the federally endangered American burying beetle. Her ideal workday is birding in the morning, keying out alpine plants in the afternoon, and trudging through a pond at night to set up a mist net for bats. So with that, I am going to turn it over to our presenters. Andrea, share whenever you want to.
Okay. So can you see my slides okay there?
We can.
All right, great. Well, thank you, Rob, for the introduction, and thank you to everyone who's in attendance today. Before we get started, I wanted to give a shout out and a thank you to our other CNHP team members on this project. Lee Greneau, Michelle Fink, Renee Rondeau, Denise Culver, and Anna Davidson. Thank you guys all for your hard work. So Sarah Marshall and I will both be contributing to this presentation today, and we'll be sharing the work that we have been doing on behalf of the Watershed Biodiversity and Connectivity Study. And Sarah, more specifically, will be sharing the work she's been doing on behalf of the EPA Wetlands grant that covers the Roaring Fork watershed. It was rather fortuitous that these projects have been taking place simultaneously in the Roaring Fork, because most, if not all of us, know water, especially in the arid and semi-arid West, defines where life is. And the Roaring Fork watershed is no exception. So knowing both where the water is or should be and when the water is critical for understanding where conservation and restoration activities should occur. So let me see if I can advance. Okay, so just to give you an idea of what we will be talking about, first we want to introduce you to the Roaring Fork watershed, where it is, and what generally defines it both ecologically and in a human context. Secondly, a little background on the Watershed Biodiversity and Connectivity Study and what the motivations and the goals for this project are. With a million acre watershed, it would take many years to intensively sample all the natural variation in this landscape. So we'll share our approach, how we are using a combination of field-based sampling and geospatial modeling to better understand the dynamics of the watershed. Sarah will come in and share the work she's been doing to update what we know about the wetlands and their importance in the Roaring Fork. And finally, how we are tying all of this critical information together to guide conservation planning and restoration activities. So for those of you guys who've never been there, welcome to the Roaring Fork watershed. This is a 930,000 acre watershed located in west central Colorado. It's a sub-basin of the Colorado River. The watershed spans all of Pitkin County and portions of Eagle, Gunnison, and Garfield counties. And according to our very own Colorado Natural Heritage Program database, over 78 rare or imperiled plants, animals, and significant plant communities occur within the watershed. Some of these species include Harrington's penstemon, Halberine orchid, boreal toad, Townsend's big-eared bat, Canada lynx, the American peregrine falcon, western bumblebees, and many, many others. Large mammal species common to the area include bighorn sheep, elk, mule deer, black bear, mountain lion, and moose. So the Roaring Fork Watershed is home to 7 of Colorado's 14,000-foot peaks. This watershed spans portions of the Sawatch, the Collegiate, and the Elk River ranges. So it's not surprising that the rugged topography and the wealth of the natural diversity here draws recreationists and tourists from around the globe year-round. The watershed is home to 5 major ski areas, gold medal trout fishing streams, world-class mountain biking, scenic hiking trails, whitewater rafting, and so much more. Tourism and recreation are both major economic drivers in the watershed. Oops. Now, while silver and gold helped attract the first European American settlers to the region, farming and ranching helped drive the bigger settlement push at the end of the 1800s. Urban development and a diversifying economy has led to a decline in active ranches and farms across the watershed. Large contiguous tracts of private working land still exist, though they have diminished in number and size over the last several decades. Both the Bureau of Land Management and the U.S. Forest Service, the 2 largest public land managers in the watershed, still support grazing allotments, and these are primarily for cattle. The major city centers of the watershed include Aspen near its headwaters, down to Basalt, Carbondale, and Glenwood Springs, where the Roaring Fork River meets the Colorado River. According to the Greater Roaring Fork Regional Housing Study, quote, relative to the state, the region accounts for 2% of Colorado's jobs, but captured more than 2.5% of the state's growth at this time. With this growth, demand for housing and associated infrastructure continues to increase, placing greater stress on the region's resources, particularly in times of drought and in the midst of our global climate change. This mounting stress has led to concern for some of the watershed's most iconic species, like mule deer, elk, and bighorn sheep, as well as black bear, beavers, birds, and pollinators. WBI, the Watershed Biodiversity Initiative, is a nonprofit organization that was created in 2018 out of concern for the future of the Roaring Fork's biodiversity and ecological vitality. So you can see on this rightmost photo, doing what I like to term avalanche chute yoga, is WBI's executive director, Tom Cardamone. And pictured on the left is his lovely family. And you can see the multi-generations represented here. And to me, even this family photo is so emblematic of what drives Tom and so many others who live and work in this watershed to protect it for future generations. So the Watershed Biodiversity Initiative has brought together the Colorado Natural Heritage Program and an amazing science team of key stakeholders from the region. These include the U.S. Forest Service, the Bureau of Land Management, Colorado Parks and Wildlife, Pitkin County Open Space and Trails, the Aspen Center for Environmental Studies, Aspen Global Change Institute, Aspen Valley Land Trust, and the Roaring Fork Conservancy, all of whom have helped us to develop a science-based, reliable, and usable strategy for keeping all the pieces, a strategy focused on protecting and restoring the watershed's biodiversity, connectivity, and ecological processes. So the goals of this project are to develop a much better understanding of the habitat quality and the threats that face our focal species in their habitats. with that to start to prioritize conservation toward those areas, as well as prioritize restoration in the areas of greatest need that would benefit these focal species. So as I mentioned in the introduction, this watershed is almost 1 million acres. So that's roughly the size of Rhode Island. So we chose an approach that combined field-based assessment and geospatial modeling. You'll see in our approach that we first emphasized developing a watershed-wide model of forage quality and subsequently habitat quality for mule deer, elk, and bighorn sheep. Populations of these focal species have declined across the watershed. The propensity of these wide-ranging animals to track plant phenology seasonally up and down the elevational gradient makes them excellent conservation umbrellas for this watershed, especially when we emphasize habitat connectivity and forage quality associated with species diversity. So in the summer of 2019, we started our field season. It was our first field season, and we capitalized on the rare opportunity that Tom Cardamone was able to facilitate for us. And that was access to over 26,000 acres of privately owned property across 8 privately owned properties. And access to private land was really a critical breakthrough for us and for this project, because private land, as you can see in the orange represented on the map on the left, those orange polygons are the a quarter of the entire land area of the watershed is represented by private land. Disproportionately, however, nearly half of all deer and elk winter range exists within private land. So getting access to private land was critical, because private land has historically represented a major conservation knowledge gap, particularly relative to the availability and the condition of habitat for this study's focal species. Large private land holdings, especially those adjacent to public lands, provide important points of animal movement, habitat connectivity, and across the entire landscape. So they're really critical pieces of this conservation puzzle. Additionally, private lands are generally under greater threat of development, of parcelization, of fragmentation. So in our second field season, which just finished this last year in 2020, we shifted our focus to the mid to high elevations of the watershed, the public lands, and those were primarily within the largest public land manager, the White River National Forest. In this watershed, public land comprises nearly 3/4 of the land area, and you can see that represented in the green on the map. So in these 2 years of field sampling, we visited a little over 80 lower to mid elevation study sites on our private lands. This included some public land visits as well. And then in 2020, we visited 50 sites spread across the mid to high elevation public lands. So our field sampling, once we got to these locations, targeted the watershed's major vegetation types. And these vegetation types included mountain shrubland, mountain meadow, mixed conifer, pinyon juniper, irrigated meadow, aspen, spruce fir, alpine, and sagebrush. And you can see with this slide that we actually paired photos from our sampling locations. And this was to show you the large spectrum that existed even within a given habitat type or community type. And that spectrum was relative to disturbance. It was relative to the structure and diversity and plant composition. Some other elements or habitat types that we covered, and this is where we had a really nice overlap with Sarah's project, is that some of the focal focal wetland types of Sarah's work were also covered in our sampling. And those included things like wet meadow, willow carr, fen, and riparian forests, many of which are incredibly important for our focal species. So to capture that landscape variability and even habitat type variability, we use line point intercept method at each of our sampling locations to estimate relative cover of all species observed on the transect. And in 2020, we were able to, let's see if I can get it to work. There we go. In 2020, we were able to use the Esri Survey 123 app to digitally track our data so that it would also be available and usable in a geospatial format. So when trees and shrubs were present, we used and this was at each site, we used a modified cold browse method, and this was to assess availability and intensity of ungulate utilization. So for instance, the aspen trees, the aspen stand you see in the center photo, those species are present at the site, but all of the green vegetative material of the aspens, the leaves, is not available to maybe a giraffe, but definitely not our focal species. So post field season, we went to work converting our field-based data into a geospatial format. So we used high resolution Google Earth imagery, and we digitized the patch boundaries representative of the communities that we assessed at each sampling location. By digitizing these patches, it allowed us to start to piece together the heterogeneity in size and vegetation community and forage quality all across the landscape. So from there, we could begin our model development process. And we started first with our forage quality model for deer and elk. So you can see here a very, very, very simplified illustration of this process. And by the way, for those of you who don't know her, that happy little computer right there is our amazing geospatial analyst, Michelle Fink. So thank you, Michelle, for all your hard work. And just to review, our focal species, deer and elk, they move across the elevational gradient of the landscape to track forage quality and quantity. And this seasonal migration has been shown by numerous studies to generally track the phenology or the green up of vegetation as it starts first in the lower elevations of the winter range and transitions upslope into summer range. Because we currently have limited empirical data on exactly where the animals are at a given time for this landscape in particular, we've defaulted to developing a forage quality model to determine where the best forage exists for these animals in the growing season and in the winter. So the field-based inputs of that model, adjusted by season, include the cover of graminoids, the cover of forbs, the cover of trees and shrubs, all of which are weighted by their species richness, their palatability, and for trees and shrubs, their availability. So that's getting back to that cold browse method that we used. And Michelle Fink, remember Happy Computer, is she uses those inputs to classify those site polygons that we digitize using the Google Earth imagery. And these classified polygons are combined with Sentinel-2 satellite imagery and 10-meter digital elevation models to train a supervised multi-category classification for the whole watershed. And she did this using the random forest machine learning algorithm. So see, easy peasy, just like the photo shows. All right, so on to our next model. We move on to our habitat quality model for our focal species. And this is intended to account for the other elements of the landscape in addition to forage that influence where elk and mule deer and bighorn sheep may occur on the landscape. So simply speaking, these elements include food, which is our forage quality model, water, the critical water features on the landscape. And this is where we have elements like topographic indices of wetness, but also where we integrate this valuable information, which Sarah is going to share about the wetlands across the watershed. We then add in our shelter element, which is our canopy cover and our distance to canopy cover, an avoidance of stress, which is our landscape disturbance index, or avoidance of anthropogenic source stress. And then, of course, the ability of the animals to move easily between all of these core elements of their habitat, and that's the landscape connectivity piece. Oops. And so I will then switch over to Sarah for a few minutes, and she's going to share a lot of the information that she's been able to gather on the wetlands and the wetland quality across the watershed.
Thanks, Andrea. And so while wetlands comprise about 2 to 3% of the landscape in Colorado, as Andrea mentioned, they do provide disproportionately high benefits to wildlife species, and their occurrence on the landscape tells us a lot about the presence of water and also a lot of unique ecological functions and processes. So the real convergence between our two projects were, where are the conservation's importance areas, and wetlands and riparian areas are, in being kind of a nexus of wildlife activity, a really important place to focus. So even though the biodiversity group has largely focused on a lot of larger scale upland habitat connectivity, these features do intersect in the landscape. And another kind of important piece in merging these two studies is looking at what finer scale wetland attributes can tell us about things like habitat quality. So like wildlife, wetlands are seasonal, and so we can use things like wetland hydro period to help tell us where the water is on the landscape and also when. And finally, another really important piece of the wetland and riparian area mapping is to identify restoration targets. So we're not only looking at large scale areas that intersect with wildlife corridors, but also areas that are in degraded condition or that may be reduced or fragmented from their historical extent. So again, really focusing on that connectivity between wetland and upland habitats, and then thinking about how we can use things like process-based restoration and really think about larger scale and longer term factors like climate resilience. And just as an example of one thing that we're thinking about, Julie Scamardo and Ellen Wool's research group at CSU has recently completed the Beaver Restoration Assessment Tool model for the whole state of Colorado. And so we're actually integrating that to help us look at not only where are the restoration priorities from groups around the Roaring Fork, but also where could there be opportunities for floodplain reconnection and other process-based restoration with beavers. Next slide. So a really important piece of integrating these two different studies was actually to go in and update some of the wetland mapping for the Roaring Fork, which a lot of it had not been updated for many decades. And in around 2012, CNHP digitized a lot of the old paper maps for the state. So that's actually a huge advance from where we were before that point. But it's been an interesting exercise to go in and really try to target our mapping updates to areas that have high conservation significance. So we've been focusing on things like integrating fen mapping. So Gabby Smith, I don't know if she's on here today, but she has done some incredible fen mapping around the headwaters of the state, and she really helped update this wetland mapping. So we brought in the revised fen mapping. She's been really focusing some of her efforts on riparian areas, beaver complexes, wet meadows, and we tried to capture areas that also had major land use changes or just generally changes in land use over time. And from there, we're able to start looking at these large scale conservation and restoration priority areas and not only integrate everything we learned from the 2019 field surveys for the wetland group, but to take into consideration the, sometimes it seems like hundreds of studies that have been done in the Roaring Fork throughout the years. And so that these restoration targets really represent not only some new areas that we've identified through the course of our fieldwork in the watershed and the wildlife modeling, but also to try to bring in all of the previous priorities in the watershed. And the final important piece of that, and we'll get to that in a little bit, is to display and update some of our web planning tools to help share this information with not only the partners in the Roaring Fork, but also partners around the state doing headwater restoration work. Next slide. And here's just a sample of some of what we found when we looked at the updated wetland mapping. So there are a total of 27,400 acres of wetlands mapped in the Roaring Fork. And here's just a little breakdown. Andrea, if you can press the next, there we go. Some kind of interesting things that emerged. Stream channels and bars are actually one of the largest mapped wetland groups in the Roaring Fork, followed by wet meadows, and then riparian shrublands, lakes and reservoirs, and then fens. An interesting little factoid about the Roaring Fork that I did not expect to see. So fens are one of our rarer and more unique wetland types in the state of Colorado. And there are actually more mapped fens in the Roaring Fork than beaver influenced wetlands, which was a little bit of a shock to me. But as you can see on this map here, there are areas that really emerge as having particularly high wetland density. So the Upper Roaring Fork, for example, which has a lot of fen area, has about 4.5% wetland area total. And then you also see high wetland area in places like the Middle Roaring Fork, where we have quite a bit of a contribution from irrigated wet meadows as well. You can also look at places like the Frying Pan, where the headwaters also have a ton of beaver complexes and fens and other unique wetland features. So this has, again, been a helpful exercise for looking at high conservation value areas like the Upper Roaring Fork. Next slide. And here's just a sample of what some of our updated wetland mapping looks like. This is near Carbondale. And again, we're just kind of looking at ecological systems within the wetland mapping versus some of the more traditional breakdowns by vegetation classes. And it's really exciting to see, riparian shrublands versus wet meadows. And we're also flagging things like irrigation influence and other factors that really can determine how these wetlands function in the landscape. Next slide. All right, I'll turn it back to Andrea.
Okay, thanks, Sarah. It was really great, like I said, for these projects to be happening simultaneously, because particularly this last summer, after a lot of the mapping Sarah had done was underway, we were able to communicate her with Sarah, where we saw some really amazing wetlands and portions of the landscape that were just really rich. With some high quality wetlands as well as upland communities in close proximity and all interwoven together. So it was really neat to then look back on the work that Sarah's done and see how it was mirrored in a lot of that wetland mapping as well. So back to our watershed conservation priorities. So really the culmination of all the work that CNHP has done on both of these studies, the model iterations, the upcoming summer's limited field season. So this summer we'll have a limited field season to ground truth and verify the models, the forage quality, the habitat quality model. And all of this ongoing review and feedback from our science team is with the ultimate goal to lead toward a collective understanding and this development of a conservation and restoration matrix for the entire watershed. So here we will merge our final habitat quality model, forage quality model for our focal species with other data layers, because Sarah had mentioned all those various other incredibly valuable studies that have occurred over the decades across the watershed. So we can start to merge a lot of that valuable data and information on conservation importance. And some of that data includes things like rare species occurrence information, the high value wetlands like Sarah had talked about, but also things like pinch points for movements of animals across the landscape relative to different types of developments, roadways, trails, etc. So all of this information will go into our matrix of conservation, and we'll be receiving feedback from our science team as we develop this so that we can start to focus on areas of greatest need for conservation, areas of highest priority for restoration. And so this information will be available in a GIS, and it will be provided to stakeholders, resource managers, landscape planners, etc. And it will provide that comprehensive understanding of where to focus conservation and restoration activities across the watershed so that we can really have our best attempt to save all the pieces for those generations. So now let me move the next slide and switch over to Sarah again. We can't hear you, Sarah. Sorry. Do over.
Sorry about that. So one important piece of what we do at CNHP is to provide conservation and restoration data to help support our partners around the state. And so ultimately, we plan to display these priority areas in our watershed planning toolbox, which some of you may be familiar with, is currently covering the Arkansas headwaters and the South Platte headwaters. So we're excited to expand the toolbox to the Roaring Fork at the end of this study and really bring in all this rich information.
So if we can give a special thanks, as I mentioned, our awesome science team who have not only provided us the on-the-ground understanding. Many of these folks live and have worked in the watershed for decades, but many of these folks listed here also joined us in the field. And as you saw, some of whom had to go over some pretty serious avalanche chutes and hike in for miles to get to a given sample site. So thank you everybody for all of your help. And then we are, of course, open for any questions or thoughts from the audience, and I'll switch it over to Rob from there.
Okay, I've opened it up to some of the attendees to shoot you some questions, but I had a couple that came up. Can we start with those? So you guys talked about this region of Colorado. It's got a lot going on for hunting, fishing, tourism, wildlife viewing, land management. What was unique about this region of Colorado that would have made this task easier, more complicated? What were some of the surprises and kind of lessons that you got from this specific region of Colorado?
I can dive in. I think from a wetland and riparian standpoint, it's pretty remarkable how many different wetland types there are in the Roaring Fork, but also just the gradient of how those types vary across kind of from the quieter parts of the furthest reaches of the headwaters all the way down to areas that intersect with ranches and recreational lands. And I think that the Roaring Fork has a uniquely high number of stakeholders involved in conserving these lands. And so it's been both challenging, but a really cool opportunity to try to integrate all of this rich amount of information and these different priorities into our mapping and modeling efforts. So that's been I think, a unique aspect of working in the Roaring Fork, at least from a wetlands and riparian side, but certainly from a habitat side as well.
Andrea, do you want to feed that?
Yeah, if I can just jump off of that, and you know, the thought was going through my head. When we think of aquatic water associated mammals, we think of beavers, right? But even deer and elk are so strongly tied to where water is on the landscape. And so that's why these projects fit together so well, because where we want to see the most productive, the richest habitats on the landscape is often in close association with our healthiest wetland systems. And so it's been great to work with Sarah and so many of the other science team members to start to tease apart a lot of these connections.
Thanks. I've got some questions from the listeners. So Mark Fuller asks, where do you expect to do your ground truthing this summer, and how will you choose those sites?
Good question, Mark. And if I had our happy computer person, Michelle Fink, on board, I don't know if Michelle is here to jump on and to lend some thoughts and ideas. But basically, we're not going to be doing the intensive site sampling that we were doing these past 2 years at our field sites. So we're going to be focusing on some more rapid assessments to check both our forage quality model as well as the connectivity piece that Michelle did even prior to our field work, and then of course the habitat quality model. So I don't have those exact locations for you yet, Mark, but they are in the works. And thank you for your question. And that Mark is an amazing photographer. That beautiful photo of the bighorn sheep was thanks to Mark.
Needless to say, it sounds like it's a really tough region to do kind of spatially balanced sampling just because of access and how you can get to these areas.
Oh, definitely. And I mean, and that was really getting us access to private land. I can't emphasize enough how important that was. One, just so we could get on the ground and have those elements of the landscape feed into our understanding. But two, if just as important, if not more so, is Tom and others, Dave Erickson, others on the science team and on this project have done an amazing job of pulling private landowners into the importance of this study, because they just like Tom and his family, they are so integrally tied to the future of this landscape.
Okay, I got another one from the audience. This is from Paul Milhauser. Excellent work. Can you provide any further details on your approach to modeling connectivity, other than the animated computer?
Paul, I unfortunately will have to default that question to Michelle as well. I know that we went through a lot of exercises building off of some previously established habitat suitability models for deer, elk, and bighorn sheep. But part of that, that process, I believe, also included some initial looks at these rare species occurrence information as well. But unfortunately, I don't have the specifics that I would be able to give you, but I'm certainly happy to get you in contact with Michelle.
So another one, this one's from Allison Galinsky. Are the updates to the wetlands available in the CNHP wetlands mapper? And the second part, what other parts of the states have you updated the wetlands data? And she's working on a project along the Rio Grande and Conejos County. And is there any updated wetlands data from that region?
That is a great and complicated question. I'm going to do my best to address it. So one unique aspect of the wetland mapping that we've done, not only in the Roaring Fork, but also in the Arkansas and South Platte headwaters, is to take the base national wetlands inventory mapping and effectively enhance it with all these different land management and wetland type attributes, as well as things like a number of our ecological systems. And so with those updates, it's a little bit different than the standard National Wetlands Inventory data product. So we will be displaying the updated and enhanced mapping in the Watershed Planning Toolbox, but it's kind of to be determined whether that will go in some form into the main wetlands mapper. I will say that there are a lot of really exciting wetlands mapping efforts happening around the state, largely funded by the Bureau of Land Management. And that will also include some of the hydrogeomorphic and other attributes that are very similar to what we've done, but they're kind of in patches around the state. So if you want to shoot me an email, I can definitely try to help you figure out if any of that updated mapping is occurring in the watershed that you mentioned. Hopefully that answers your question. It's a slightly complicated topic, but we're kind of right now just figuring out the balance between the very rigorous national wetlands inventory standards and then trying to meet the needs of our conservation partners around the state who are really interested in using the mapping for things like identifying restoration sites.
Yeah, it sounds like the whole process of wetland mapping, understanding where those are, is a monumental task. And maybe not everybody in the audience is familiar with the history that CNHP has had in that process. Would you be willing just to briefly kind of elaborate on how that's built and what role CNHP has played in that?
Absolutely. So the National Wetlands Inventory is a U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service data product, akin to the National Hydrography data set that many of you may be familiar with. And so even just getting the initial paper maps in the 1970s and 80s across the United States is a pretty monumental effort. And then digitizing those efforts which was a CNHP role, again, starting around 2012, was a pretty big deal in itself as well. So we do have statewide coverage for those data layers, and CNHP has certainly done mapping updates around the states, often tied to particular funded projects. So as an example, we did update the National Wetland Inventory mapping for the Arkansas and South Platte headwaters. There have also been some updates in the Front Range and elsewhere in the state. That said, in the mountain headwaters around a lot of the state, we do still have a lot of fairly old wetland mapping. And so, again, we've been kind of trying to juggle, how can we get decent resolution data that can help support these large scale prioritization efforts on where to go to protect our water resources at the source. But also acknowledging that, it takes a lot of time and resources to update wetland mapping. And it's typically done on a quad by quad or topographic quad basis. So these efforts are kind of unique in that we're trying to update and enhance entire watersheds to help with watershed planning efforts. Hopefully that answers your question. It's a pretty complicated process, but it's definitely one of our most useful data sets when we do these really large scale planning efforts for wetlands and riparian areas.
And that was great. I just wanted to make sure the audience is familiar with the level of activity that CNHP has had in that, and maybe how they can get access to it. And I think your QR code in one of those slides was a quick access to one of the tools that you guys have available. Yes. Thank you for posting that, Andrea. I tested that and it actually works even through a presentation. Yay. Okay. So another question from Mark. Sarah, some of our wetlands are dependent on current patterns and methods of irrigation. Will your wetlands maps comment on the interdependence of wetlands occurrence and quality and ongoing irrigation practices?
That is a really important and good question, Mark. So what we're currently doing is we're looking at the state irrigation layers from the Division of Water Resources and seeing where there are intersections between things like wet meadows and those irrigated lands layers. That's the somewhat easier part of that question. As you probably know, in a lot of these agricultural landscapes, the relationships between wetland hydrology and kind of pre-settlement wetland hydrology relative to what we see today is a very complicated one, particularly when we consider things like irrigation return flows, but also everything from natural groundwater features, which are quite prevalent in the Roaring Fork, and also things like changes to the flow regime of rivers and tributaries. So everything from water being pulled across the divide as part of transbasin diversions to dam releases and what that has collectively done for connectivity between streams and their floodplains. So we're kind of doing our best, but there's, I think, a lot of opportunity to dig into that further. And I think that particularly when we're thinking about how irrigated land is managed in the Colorado River Basin, especially in the headwaters with things like flood irrigation, that's a really important consideration prior to any major water management changes.
Sounds like a complicated wrestling match that I'm glad you get to tackle. I have one for you. We still have a few minutes left, but you mentioned the propensity of fens in this region. Why? For those of us who don't understand all the intricacies of fen development and the history of those, can you tell us why you think there's that many in this area of Colorado?
Yeah, and I wish a few other folks were on to answer that question as well, but I suspect in traveling across a lot of the headwaters in the Roaring Fork, a lot of times fens are linked to unique geologic formations and geologic contacts. So, for example, one area that I found a number of fens that we hadn't previously documented, there's actually some limestone formations in that area. So possibly even some interesting karst type topography in the subsurface. Sometimes geological contacts and fault lines. I'm not a geologist, but those are definitely areas where you sometimes find fens. Also, certainly any areas that you have groundwater outcropping. So again, sometimes those are things like topographic breaks, which looking at some of the maps that Andrea shared earlier, the Roaring Fork is a very topographically complex watershed in terms of elevation gradients and just very steep topographic gradients. So I think all those factors kind of come into play and make the Roaring Fork a really special watershed. It's something we've certainly seen in other watersheds like the Arkansas and South Platte headwaters as well, where you have really interesting geology. It's often where you find cool wetland types like fens.
Thanks. I'm not seeing any more submitted questions via the chat or the Q&A. So I want to thank you two for taking the time to present on this work. This is a region of Colorado that commonly gets visited by outsiders. And so it's great to have this highlighted as a region where CNHP is doing this kind of conservation work and trying to understand what are the bigger conservation issues and management issues in a region like this. Especially one that gets highlighted as much as it does. So barring any last minute questions, I'm going to thank you guys for taking the time, and thank you everybody out in the audience for joining us. Join us again April 12th for a presentation on the rare plant monitoring that Colorado Natural Heritage Program coordinates and conducts. Again, thanks everybody. Have a wonderful week, and hopefully you won't be getting any more snow anytime soon. Bye everyone.